A simple stroll home or a setup where a dishonest police officer believes he can degrade and frame an 8-year-old black girl. He is unaware that he has chosen the wrong person. She isn't just any child, she is the one who can hold him accountable. What follows is a battle. This story is about to take a turn that will leave you speechless. Please let us know what time you're watching and where you're tuning in from by leaving a comment below. A story of power, corruption, and cold, hard justice is unfolding right before your eyes, and I promise you won't see the ending coming until we dive in. Charleston, South Carolina, a city steeped in history, where cobblestone streets weave between old brick buildings and the air carries the faint scent of salt from the nearby harbor. It's a place where time feels slower, where neighbors know one another, and children walk home from school without a second thought. But today would be different. Something was about to happen that would shake this quiet southern town to its core. Elijah Brooks, just 10 years old, strolled down Magnolia Lane, her small feet tracing a well-worn path beneath the canopy of oaks that lined the street. Spanish moss swayed lazily in the breeze, the late afternoon sun casting golden rays that danced across the pavement. To anyone watching, she was just another child finishing her day. Her pink backpack bounced with each step, her long braids swung, and she hummed softly to herself. There was peace in her heart. She had just left Mrs. Langley's piano lesson, the sound of music still lingering in her mind. That walk home was her time to unwind, to breathe, to feel safe. The world felt right to Elijah. She passed the bakery on the corner, where old Mr. Hughes always waved from the window, the smell of fresh bread filling the air. Across the street, Miss Evelyn tended to her rose bushes, lifting her wide-brimmed hat just enough to flash a kind smile. It was a picture of small-town America, simple, familiar, safe. But that's the thing about moments like these, they can vanish in an instant. And this time, it was going to vanish fast. It began with the faint sound of a siren, soft at first, like a distant echo barely reaching the edges of Elijah's world. She paused mid-step, her humming falling silent as she turned her head slightly, listening. The siren grew louder, slicing through the air like a blade. The sound didn't belong here, not on Magnolia Lane, not where children played hopscotch and neighbors swapped recipes. The patrol car came around the corner too quickly, its lights flashing wildly, the siren wailing louder now, bouncing off the brick walls and shaking the calm of the afternoon. Elijah instinctively stepped aside, as any child would, expecting the car to pass. But it didn't. Instead, it slowed and stopped right beside her. The driver's door creaked open, the siren cutting off in a sudden, jarring silence, and Officer Bradley Kessler emerged. His attire was impeccable, his boots shiny, but the expression in his eyes was unpolished. Elijah had seen him before. He was well known throughout Charleston, with a reputation for being a harsh, quick-to-anger officer who didn't make people feel safe. He towered over her, his broad shoulders casting a shadow that seemed much too big for the small sidewalk. "Hey, what are you doing here, girl?" he said, his voice piercing the atmosphere like a whip. She was just walking home, she always walked this way. Why was he yelling? Elijah blinked in surprise, her heart racing. "I'm just walking home," she stammered, but the words got stuck in her throat. Kessler stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as if he didn't hear her or perhaps didn't care. His gaze pinned her in place, cold and sharp, as if she had done something wrong, as if she didn't belong here. His tone wasn't inquisitive but accusatory. Elijah's hands tightened their grip on her bag straps. "Yes, sir," she spoke, the words barely audible. She could feel the heat radiating off the concrete and the weight of Kessler's shadow pushing down, but he didn't back away. Instead, he stepped closer, towering over her. "Don't lie to me, girl," he said. Even though his voice had lowered, it still made her shudder. "There's been some trouble in this neighborhood lately." But Elijah had no idea what he was talking about. This was her house, her street, her neighbors. Just yesterday, she had helped Miss Evelyn with grocery shopping, and this morning, she had waved to Mr. Hughes. But none of that mattered to him. And then it happened, suddenly and without explanation. The metal of the shackles clicked tightly around her little wrists, cutting into her flesh as Kessler's harsh hold was too tight for a child. "Please, I didn't do anything," Elijah exclaimed. "You're under arrest," Kessler mumbled, ignoring her plea. Arrest for what? She was 10 years old. Everything she believed to be her safety, her home, her street, everything, crumbled beneath her feet. Neighbors stood motionless on their porches, some pulling out their phones to record from behind their fences, but no one stepped forward to offer assistance. Elijah's chest tightened. She wanted to scream, she wanted to flee, but Kessler pushed her toward the back of the squad car, where the cold metal of the handcuffs bit deeper. Karma would arrive 3 minutes later, but for now, all Elijah could feel was fear, the kind of fear that number 10-year-old should ever experience. It would soon reverberate far beyond Magnolia Lane because this wasn't just about one child and one officer. This was about something bigger. You won't want to miss what happened next, so stay with us because this story is only getting started. I promise you, the ending will leave you speechless. With a force that seemed to shake the entire block, the squad car's rear door slammed shut. Elijah sat in the back seat, her small figure crushed against the chilly vinyl, the steel of the handcuffs pressing into her wrists. The gentle bounce of her backpack was gone. The stinging shock of fear rumbling through her body had replaced the peace that had been there only seconds before. The street had now fallen into an unsettling calm. The brilliant afternoon light suddenly made the neighbors feel much colder and dimmer as they stood motionless on their porches. Some held up their phones to film, but their eyes spoke a different tale, of unease and discomfort, fear not of the little girl in cuffs, but of what might happen if they stepped forward. Kessler approached the front of the car with heavy, deliberate steps, as if every move was intended to establish dominance. He opened the driver's side door, got inside, and slammed it shut. For a moment, he sat without turning the key. Elijah's eyes darted toward the windshield. The outside world seemed like a dream she couldn't wake up from. Her neighbors, the houses she passed every day, everything felt so familiar and now so distant. As the car started to pull away, something changed across the street. Allelainer Jameson, a woman well into her 70s, stood on her porch, her hands shaking slightly as she held her phone. Her eyes were wide with shock. She had witnessed the entire event, from the time Kessler pulled up until Elijah was dragged into that squad car. Allelainer knew how things operated in this town. She had lived here long enough to see things others preferred to ignore. While many might have written off what she witnessed as part of protocol, she knew this wasn't right. Her fingers fumbled as she scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she needed. She hit call, held the phone to her ear, and whispered urgently, "Sharon Mullery, it's Allelainer Jameson. Something happened. You must get down here immediately. Kessler just took Elijah Brooks." That call would change everything. But back inside the patrol car, Elijah didn't know any of that. She sat there, her heart pounding, her breathing shallow, as they drove away from the street she'd always called home. Kessler didn't say a word. His eyes stayed fixed on the road, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might crack. The only sound was the steady thrum of the engine and the occasional creak of the handcuffs when Elijah shifted in her seat, trying to find even the smallest bit of comfort. But there was no comfort here. There was only the cold realization that something terrible was happening, and she had no idea how to stop it. As the car turned the corner, heading toward the precinct, the street behind them remained in stunned silence. But that silence wouldn't last long. Back on Magnolia Lane, the neighbors began to stir. Phones buzzed as messages flew from one household to the next. "Did you see that? Why'd he arrest that little girl? That was Elijah Brooks, she's only 10. A ripple of concern moved through the community, but for some, concern wasn't enough. Some just stood there, their faces set with worry but unwilling to speak out. They'd seen too much, heard too many stories about what happened when people got involved. But for Allelainer Jameson, standing firm on her porch, watching that patrol car disappear, that wasn't an option. She could still feel the weight of history on her shoulders. The tales of her father participating in demonstrations in the 1960s echoed a time when people were forced to stand up for what was right. To her, this felt the same today. Meanwhile, inside the patrol car, the world was closing in on Elijah. Her thoughts raced back to her mother, her school, the piano lessons she had just left behind. Would they know where she was? Would anyone even come for her? Her lips trembled, and she squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself not to cry, not here, not in front of him. Harold Thomas, a retired firefighter in his late 60s, put down his rake and picked up his phone. He didn't have a fancy smartphone, but he knew how to make a call and who to call. On the steering wheel, Officer Kessler's knuckles turned white. He wasn't expressing what was on his mind, but he could sense it. His phone was vibrating in his pocket, and he ignored the constant hum of incoming calls and texts to focus on the road. However, a storm was building in Charleston. Detective Sharon Mallory's phone rang again. "Sharon, it's happening again. Kessler took Elijah Brooks into custody," the voice said. The line went silent for a moment, then Mallory's voice dropped, steady and purposeful. "I'm on my way." There were still people in Charleston who wouldn't stand for this any longer. As Elijah sat in that squad car, her wrists bound, her heart heavy with fear, the wheels of justice were starting to turn, the kind of justice Officer Kessler never saw coming. Stay with us because this story is far from over, and what comes next might just rekindle your faith or kindle your fire. Either way, you won't forget it, not today, never. It was just another peaceful afternoon when Sharon Mallory stood in her kitchen, a cool breeze blowing through the window, the subtle scent of coffee mingling in the air. She leaned against the counter, browsing headlines on her tablet, until her phone buzzed. It wasn't a casual call, the name flashing across the screen was Alalainer Jameson, who didn't call for light conversation. Alalainer was a stable, well-respected member of Charleston's old guard, and if she was calling, something was amiss. Without hesitation, Sharon answered. The voice on the other end quivered, but the words were sharp and urgent. "Sharon, I need you to listen. Officer Kessler just detained Elijah Brooks, the little girl, Henry Whitaker's granddaughter. I saw the whole thing. He pulled up on Magnolia Lane, grabbed her, cuffed her, shoved her into the back of his car like she was a criminal. She didn't do a thing." Sharon's breath caught in her throat. "Elijah Brooks," she repeated, her voice falling to a whisper. "Where did he take her?" "Headed toward the station," she asked. "I saw the whole thing," Alalainer remarked. "But Sharon, you have to stop this. She's just a child." Sharon's mind was focused and alert. She knew Kessler's reputation and had heard the complaints. Rumors swirled beneath Charleston's civilized society that he played rough, especially with black children. But this was more than she had anticipated. She hung up after speaking with Alalainer. As the engine roared to life, Sharon connected to the department's internal system and pulled up Kessler's body cam feed. As the footage rolled in, she saw Elijah Brooks standing on the sidewalk, small and vulnerable, her backpack slung over her shoulder, her braids swaying as she tried to explain herself. Kessler towered over her, barking questions, his tone sharp, his body language aggressive. Sharon's gut twisted as she watched him grasp the child's wrist as if she were a threat and wrap her small wrists in cold steel. The video ended with Elijah pushed into the squad car, and Sharon struck the steering wheel. In her 30 years on the force, she had seen too many officers cross the line, hiding behind their badges, acting untouchable. But this time, with Henry Whitaker's granddaughter, it wouldn't be another case buried in paperwork and silence. She pressed the gas harder, speeding toward the station, her mind racing. She could already picture the fallout. Judge Whitaker was not just any federal judge, he was a man who demanded respect and had dedicated his life to enforcing the law. Now that his granddaughter was handcuffed because Kessler couldn't check his bias, things were going to get ugly. The precinct, a solid brick house that had stood for years, came into view, its front steps worn down by the boots of countless officers. Tonight, it felt as though the walls would move. Sharon parked out front, killed the engine, and stepped out, squaring her shoulders. She could feel the tension in the air before she even crossed the lot, something heavy, electric, the kind of tension that builds before a storm. Inside the squad room, officers milled about, their chatter dull under the fluorescent lights. But as Sharon walked through the doors, the energy shifted. Heads turned, eyes followed. They knew her, knew what she stood for, and when she moved like this, fast, focused, they knew better than to get in her way. She marched straight to the watch commander's desk. "Where's Kessler?" she demanded. The young sergeant behind the desk hesitated, eyes wide. "Bringing someone in." "Just got here," he said, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. "A little girl," Sharon snapped, not waiting for more. She turned on her heel, heading straight for the intake area. And there he was, Kessler, dragging Elijah Brooks by the arm, her small feet stumbling to keep up, her face pale, her lips pressed tight to hold back tears. Her backpack hung awkwardly off one shoulder, as though it didn't belong in this sterile, cold place. Sharon walked straight into Kessler's path, her words piercing the room like a blade. "Kessler, let her go." He halted, his jaw tensing. "Detective Maliri, I'm dealing with a suspect," he said. "You call this handling?" Sharon snapped. "She's 10 years old." Kessler's eyes darted, but he squared his shoulders, puffing his chest. "She was acting suspiciously," he said, his voice brimming with incredulity as if she weren't a child walking home from piano lessons. Kessler's hold on Elijah's arm tightened just a bit, but Sharon noticed and moved closer, lowering her voice without losing authority. "Remove her cuffs." The room fell silent. Other officers shifted, some looking away, others waiting to see what would happen next. Before Kessler could respond, the precinct's front doors opened, and someone entered. Judge Henry Whitaker strode forward, his eyes fixed on Kessler, his tall, authoritative presence silencing the room. "What's happening?" Whitaker's voice boomed, steady and unwavering. Sharon turned to face him, her jaw set like stone. "Officer Kessler has arrested your granddaughter, sir." Kessler shifted abruptly, uncertain, and opened his mouth to speak, but Whitaker's stare pierced him. "Take off the handcuffs." Kessler hesitated too long, and Whitaker took another step forward, towering. With fumbling hands, Kessler grabbed the key and removed the shackles from Elijah's wrists. Officer Bradley Kessler's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned bone white as the patrol car rumbled down the narrow streets of Charleston. The tires hummed against the asphalt as the city passed by in a blur of red brick and iron gates. The late afternoon sun slanted across the windshield, but Kessler's gaze remained fixed ahead, his jaw so tight it looked like it might snap. In the back seat, Elijah Brooks sat in silence, her small frame dwarfed by the leather seat, her wrists raw where the handcuffs had dug into her skin. Her head was down, her braids spilling across her shoulders like a curtain she could hide behind. She couldn't see Kessler's face, but she didn't have to, she could feel his anger radiating through the car like heat from the engine. She tried to keep her breathing steady, but the fear weighed heavily on her chest, pressing against her ribs like a weight she couldn't shake. She looked out the window, watching familiar streets roll by, stores where she had bought candy, parks, churches where she had sung hymns with her mother. But those places felt distant now, like memories of a different life. Her mind raced with unanswered questions. Why was this happening? What had she done wrong? Would her mother know where she was? Her chest twisted with furious, piercing thoughts. Even as he drove, something gnawed at the back of Kessler's mind. His phone kept vibrating against his hip. His radio crackled to life, but he turned the volume down to silence the dispatcher's voice before it could fill the space between them. He didn't want the distraction, he needed control, and control meant quiet. The department's group chat was ablaze with cops asking questions, detectives pinging him for updates, even the watch commander sending messages, but Kessler ignored them. Text after text, call after call, all unanswered. This time, the buzzing of his phone wasn't just background noise, it was the sound of a crack growing beneath his feet. He reminded himself this was just another routine stop, a suspect, something he'd done 1,000 times before. But he couldn't see it yet. As the car turned onto Bay Street, Kessler caught his reflection in the rearview mirror, his eyes hard and flat. But for a brief moment, there was a flicker of doubt, perhaps the weight of what was coming. In the back seat, Elijah blinked back tears she wouldn't let fall, not here, not in front of him. The tightness in her chest and the sting of the handcuffs made it hard to hold on. She thought of her mother's gentle, comforting voice, assuring her, everything will be all right, baby girl. But that voice seemed so far away now, muffled by the sound of the engine and the sharp edge of fear cutting through her mind. When Kessler's phone buzzed again, he didn't look. Instead, he stepped out, slammed the door shut, and ripped open the back door. He parked, shook, and sat for a moment, holding the wheel as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. Out, he yelled. Elijah winced but complied, her legs feeling like jelly as she slid off the seat. The hard concrete beneath her shoes grounded her but offered no solace. Kessler took hold of her arm again, harshly, unforgivingly, and guided her to the station doors. As they entered, heads turned. Officers looked up from their desks, conversations paused mid-sentence. No one spoke, and the tension in the room thickened like fog. The building loomed large, its brick facade cold and impersonal. Inside, fluorescent lights flickered, the sterile smell of bleach and coffee hanging in the air. Word was getting out, the calls and texts weren't just background noise anymore. Elijah's tiny feet struggled to keep up with Kessler's hefty strides as he dragged her down the corridor toward the intake area. She wanted to scream, but her words remained trapped inside, buried beneath the terror. Her arms ached from the handcuffs, her heart thumped so loudly it echoed in her ears. Kessler pushed open the intake room door and gestured for her to sit on a harsh metal bench against the wall. Kessler stood for a moment, looking at her as if struggling to decide what to do next. He fumbled with his phone, finally giving in to the vibration against his hip. He glanced at the screen, and the text hit him like a hammer, "Where's the kid? What's going on with Elijah Brooks? Mallory's looking for you. You're done." Sharon's voice echoed in his mind, low but powerful. Kessler stiffened. "I was doing my job," he muttered. "That wasn't your job," Sharon's words snapped back in his memory. "That was a 10-year-old girl." His stomach twisted, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. In the mirror above the intake desk, he didn't recognize the man staring back. Out in the main hall, the door swung open. Detective Sharon Mallory had arrived. She didn't need to speak at first, her presence filled the room with the calm before a storm. Kessler opened his mouth to defend himself, but no words could undo what had been done. Outside the station, the wheels of justice were turning. Calls were being made, reporters were gathering, and Judge Whitaker was already on his way. For Kessler, the walls of that precinct, which had once given him a sense of power, were starting to close in. Elijah sat quietly in the back of that intake room, staring at the floor, not realizing the tide was changing. But she would soon realize it, because that's where the Rayall story begins. Trust me, you'll want to stay for that. The Charleston precinct's fluorescent lights flickered faintly overhead, casting long, sterile shadows down the narrow hallway. The building felt colder now, as if the walls themselves could sense something was about to break. Detective Sharon Mallory, who had worked in this department for over 20 years, walked purposefully, her heels hitting the tile floor in a steady, deliberate rhythm. Today felt different. The tension in the air thickened as she approached the intake room, the weight of what she had seen on Kessler's body cam pressing heavily on her chest. Officers gave her a short glance before hurriedly checking their papers or focusing hard on their monitors, acting unaware. Everyone had seen the video, heard the commotion. It was time for a reckoning. Elijah Brooks, the 10-year-old granddaughter of federal Judge Henry Whitaker, had been taken off the street in handcuffs like a criminal, shoved into the back of a squad car as if her existence were a threat. Sharon pushed open the intake room door and entered. Elijah sat on the cold metal bench, her legs dangling just above the floor, her small hands resting awkwardly in her lap, her wrists still red from the freshly removed handcuffs. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, her braids hanging like a curtain to shield her from the outside world. The girl hadn't spoken since she arrived, her silence louder than any protest. Bradley Kessler stood at the far end of the room, arms crossed, his face fixed in that hard, unyielding expression Sharon had grown all too familiar with. His eyes narrowed slightly, but there was a glimmer of uncertainty, perhaps even fear, the kind that arises when you realize you've crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. "We need to talk," Sharon said, her voice quiet but firm. Kessler squared his shoulders. "I followed protocol, Detective Mulleary." The girl was acting strangely. Sharon's eyes narrowed. "You thought a 10-year-old girl carrying sheet music and a backpack full of school books was your suspect?" "She was walking home from piano lessons." Kessler shot back, his voice rising in desperation. "She fit the description." Sharon's jaw tightened as she stepped closer, lowering her voice but not her authority. "There was no description, Kessler." The silence between them was strained. Kessler started to reply, but before he could finish, the door behind Sharon creaked open. All eyes turned to the entrance as Judge Henry Whitaker entered. Tall, wearing a sharp navy suit, his silver hair combed neatly, he commanded the room without a word. His gaze swept the scene, the young child sitting quietly on the cold metal bench, the officer standing stiffly with arms crossed, his face hardened. "Where's my granddaughter?" Whitaker's voice boomed, deep and steady, capable of silencing a courtroom. Elijah looked up, saw him, and remained motionless, as if she couldn't believe he was there. Then she slipped off the bench, her tiny feet padding softly across the room, and ran into his open arms. "I'm here now, baby girl," he said, his voice softer, loving. "You're safe." Whitaker knelt, wrapping her in a protective embrace, shielding her from the coldness of the room and the eyes that had regarded her like a suspect rather than a child. For a moment, nothing else mattered. Then Whitaker turned back to Kessler, his gaze so heavy that the officer shifted on his feet. "Remove yourself from this room," Whitaker commanded, his tone brooking no rebuttal. Kessler's pride flared, he paused, turning to Sharon as if expecting her to defend him. She didn't. Kessler clenched his jaw, nodded rigidly, and turned on his heel, his boots echoing hollowly down the hallway. Whitaker turned back to Sharon. "I hope there will be an investigation." "There already is," Sharon replied. "Body cam footage, witnesses, we're gathering everything." Whitaker nodded, but his eyes were still clouded with anger. "Make sure it's thorough," he said, speaking not just as a grandfather but as a judge. As they stood there, the door creaked open again, more slowly this time. A junior officer stuck his head inside, his face pale, eyes wide. "The media's outside. They know." Of course, they knew. The story had spread like wildfire, texts, calls, social media posts, a 10-year-old black girl arrested without cause. Elijah nodded, though her lips quivered as she tried to stand tall and be brave. Sharon could see the weight of the day pressing down on her tiny shoulders. It was the kind of story that didn't stay local. Whitaker let out a slow breath. "We'll face them, but not yet." He turned back to Elijah, crouching to her level. "We're going home soon, but first, we make sure they understand what they've done." Sharon stepped closer, her voice gentle. "Elijah, can I get you some water, something to eat?" Elijah shook her head, her voice soft. "I just want to go home." Whitaker stood again. "We'll make sure you do." But as they turned to leave the intake room, Sharon held out a hand. "Judge Whitaker, you should see this first." She gestured to a wall-mounted monitor displaying the body cam footage of Kessler's arrest. As the video played, the room grew quieter. The squad car pulled up, sirens faded, and Kessler stepped out, towering over Elijah on the silent sidewalk. His voice was accusing, sharp, his hands rough as he grabbed her wrists, the cuffs snapping into place. The video ended with Elijah pushed into the back of the car, her eyes wide, her lips quivering. Whitaker stood motionless, his jaw clenched so firmly his teeth ground together. "I'll see to it personally," he said, his voice loud with emotion. "This won't go unanswered." As they left the precinct, the wheels of justice began to turn. This wasn't just about Elijah, it was about every child who had ever been treated like they didn't matter. For Officer Kessler, the reckoning had just begun. This is the part you've been waiting for. The morning after everything changed was tense. The air over Charleston was heavy with the smell of rain that hadn't yet fallen. It wasn't just any morning, it was the kind of day when everything feels different, even before you realize it. The public held its breath, anticipating the storm brewing in the Charleston Police Department. There was an unmistakable shift in mood in the days following Elijah's illegal arrest. Officers moved in their typical cadence, but whispers in the hallways carried a bite. This wasn't an event that could be dismissed easily, not with the entire town watching, the story spreading like wildfire. Elijah Brooks was no longer just a child caught up in a mistake. She had become a symbol, a living testament to what had gone wrong, to what was broken. While the news splashed across social media, newspaper articles, and TV screens nationwide, it wasn't just the media watching. There were other eyes, those of people who had lived through times of injustice, who understood the weight of this moment. It wasn't just one officer's misstep, it was a larger, more insidious problem. That weight fell squarely on Officer Bradley Kessler. By the time Sharon Mullery arrived at the precinct that morning, the usual bustle felt like a distant hum, barely noticeable against the tension in the air. She parked outside, her car's tires scraping against the pavement. As she turned off the engine, she felt the unease pressing down like a vice. She'd seen things in her years on the force that made her sick, dealt with corruption and prejudice that sometimes festered just beneath the surface. But this was different. This wasn't a one-off incident. It was something far more serious and dangerous, something that could no longer be ignored. Sharon moved through the hallway, her footsteps echoing loudly in the otherwise quiet space. Officers who had been present when Elijah was brought in barely looked up as she passed, too preoccupied with hushed conversations and growing anxiety. Sharon didn't stop to talk. She knew where she was going, straight to the chief of police's office, where he would give her the all-clear. The room was dimly lit, papers strewn across the desk. The chief looked up, his eyes obscured by the thick frames of his glasses. "Sharon," he said, his voice steady but exhausted. "I've read the reports, watched the video. This is more than a little event. Elijah Brooks was arrested without cause, and based on what I've seen, Kessler has done this before." The chief didn't react right away, his fingers drumming against the desk's edge. Sharon could see the weight of his silence. "Chief, this is a pattern," she said, her voice unwavering. She'd come too far to back down. He was apprehended. He knew the truth but was reluctant to acknowledge it. "We've had reports," he whispered, almost to himself. "Some are old, but this blows everything wide open. The media won't let this go. They're not stopping until we do something." Sharon's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't just worried about the media, she was concerned that people had become accustomed to things like this happening. At first, they seemed inconsequential, but eventually, they became a call to action, a rallying cry. The chief looked up, his expression steady but frustrated. "So, what now?" "We investigate," Sharon said, her voice piercing. "We gather all the information on Kessler's arrests, watch his body cam footage, speak with witnesses, and hold him accountable." The chief's eyes narrowed. "And if it's still not clear, we keep looking until we find a solution." Sharon's words were final, she wasn't asking, she was telling. The chief took a deep breath, glancing at the desk before nodding. Okay, I'll support you, but keep me informed. This is going to get messy. It already is, Sharon replied, turning to the door. There was no turning back now, she realized as she left the office, the truth sinking into her bones. This wasn't just about Kessler, it was about the entire department, about everything allowed to go unchecked for too long. The investigation would be difficult, complicated, messy, but it had to happen, for Elijah, for every person who had been silenced, ignored, or mistreated. By the time she reached the interrogation room, the tension had reached a breaking point. Sharon took a deep breath and stepped inside. Kessler sat at the table, hands folded, his uniform clean, but the atmosphere around him changed. He wasn't the self-assured officer he'd been the day before. He was a man lost in his own web of deceit. Kessler, Sharon said, her tone strong but controlled, we need to talk. He didn't look up at first, but when he did, there was a coldness in his eyes, yet beneath it, something like dread. I followed protocol, he started, but Sharon cut him off. Don't give me your, I was following procedure, crap, Kessler. I've been doing this job too long to buy it. You know exactly what you did, and now you're going to pay the price for it. The weight of Kessler's actions settled in, and Sharon's voice grew colder. You think your badge will protect you this time? It won't. As Kessler sat there, the silence between them was thick with the realization that his fate was sealed. Sharon knew that whatever happened next wouldn't just be his reckoning, it would be the reckoning of an entire system that had failed too many people for too long. It wasn't over by a long shot. The morning after the altercation at the precinct, Charleston seemed to hold its breath. The normal hum of traffic, the clink of coffee cups from local cafes, and the murmur of early conversations felt muted, as if the town was waiting. Sharon's phone buzzed as she left the room, a message from the chief, get ready. This just got bigger. The storm had come, and it wasn't going anywhere. Stay with us because this story is only just beginning, and trust me, what's next will leave you speechless. Elijah Brooks, the young girl pulled off the street the previous day, was more than a name in the press. She was at the center of a movement people could feel in their bones. Sharon Mullery, still reeling from the previous day's confrontation, arrived at the precinct early, long before the first officer. She'd barely slept, her mind spinning from everything she'd witnessed, Kessler's treatment of Elijah, his attempt to defend his actions. She knew the days ahead wouldn't be easy. The department buzzed with rumors that Kessler's arrest of Elijah had started a firestorm no one could ignore. Sharon forced the precinct doors open and walked straight to the chief's office. The door was open, but he didn't look up as she entered, sitting at his desk, poring over papers, his face drawn with exhaustion. When he finally met her gaze, she saw the frustration behind his eyes. This is getting out of control faster than we can handle, Sharon said, her voice flat. The media's all over it. It's all over the city, and now we've got to answer for it. Standing before his desk, arms crossed, she was already thinking through the next steps. We answer by doing what's right, she said firmly. The chief sighed, leaning back in his chair. I know, but accountability isn't always simple. You've seen what happens when these things get out of hand, the backlash, the protests, how it can tear a department apart. I'm not worried about the department, Sharon replied. I'm worried about Elijah. I'm worried about the people counting on us to do the right thing. This isn't just about Kessler. The chief stared at her, his face drawn, considering her words. Finally, he nodded. I'm with you, Sharon, but get all the facts. We need to move fast, and everything's got to be airtight. Kessler's going to fight this. I know, Sharon said. But we're not backing down. Not now. Not after everything Elijah's been through. Sharon turned to go, but the chief spoke again before she reached the door, his voice quieter. Just make sure we do it exactly right. Across town, Charleston's atmosphere was shifting as word of Elijah's injustice spread. People whispered in grocery stores, on porches, at church. Some stood by, unsure, too afraid to get involved. Others were furious. They'd seen it before, the way some officers treated people who looked like Elijah, black, young, vulnerable. They knew it was wrong. This time, they weren't staying quiet. Elijah had become a symbol of something larger, race, power, a system that too often failed those in need. Local news stations covered the story non-stop, the video of Elijah's confusion, fear, and helplessness broadcast on TV screens, front pages, and social media. Sharon heard the rumblings of dissent, saw signs drawn in windows, and knew protests would soon begin, demanding justice for Elijah and an end to police brutality. The outrage was understandable, but Sharon was more concerned about what would happen if people called for real change. Could the department survive it? Later that afternoon, Judge Henry Whitaker was an unexpected guest at the precinct. The moment he entered, the room fell silent. A titan of the legal profession, he'd seen everything, but his presence commanded attention. He looked straight at Sharon. "I need to know what's being done to fix this. I need to know what's happening to Officer Kessler." The chief shifted uneasily but remained silent. Treating Elijah like a criminal for nothing more than walking home from school, Whitaker's voice carried across the room, his authority filling every corner. "You will find Kessler. You will hold him accountable. And if you don't, I will personally see that every detail of this is exposed. The world is watching." Sharon's eyes furrowed, recognizing the weight of his words. Justice and accountability were the priorities, not just for officers but for everyone who allowed this behavior to go unchecked. It was no longer just about Elijah. Whitaker's words settled, leaving silence in the room. But Sharon wasn't scared. She had a job to do and wouldn't stop until the truth was revealed. That evening, a wave of solidarity rose. People who had been silent began to speak. Neighbors gathered outside homes, discussing demands for answers. In the days that followed, petitions circulated, and local leaders united to demand reform in the police department. Sharon felt a quiet sense of hope. As she prepared for the next step in the investigation, she knew the road ahead would be challenging, but things were changing. Elijah's story had ignited a fire that couldn't be extinguished. The truth would finally be acknowledged, and change was coming. The evening of the town hall meeting arrived, the air in Charleston thick with anticipation. People gathered in the community center, a large hall with high ceilings and rows of folding chairs set in neat rows. The room buzzed with quiet conversations as locals filed in, their faces a mix of determination and uncertainty. Some were there because they'd lived through this before, others because they could no longer stay silent. But they all had one thing in common: they had come for Elijah Brooks, the little girl pulled off the street, treated like a criminal for walking home. It had started as one officer's mistake but had become a movement. Inside, Sharon Mollery stood off to the side, arms crossed, her gaze scanning the crowd. She felt the weight of the moment, something electric in the air. This wasn't just about Elijah anymore, not just one child. It was about the community demanding change, accountability, and assurance that this would never happen again. The community center's walls were covered in posters with straightforward, impactful messages: justice for Elijah, end police brutality, accountability. But it wasn't just the signs that filled Sharon with pride, it was the faces around her. She took out her phone, glancing at a message from Judge Henry Whitaker: "We're here. We'll be ready when you are." Sharon grinned, slipping the phone back into her pocket. The judge wasn't just there as Elijah's grandfather, he was a symbol of what could be achieved when the right people stood up, when those in authority used their influence for good. The clock ticked down to the hour, and the crowd took their seats. The mayor, a woman Sharon had known for years, took the podium and called the meeting to order. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she said, her eyes sweeping the crowd. "We've come together not just to talk about the tragic events that happened to Elijah Brooks, but to ensure something like this never happens again. We are here because we believe in accountability, in justice, and that those who serve and protect our community should be held to the highest standards." The mayor's words hung in the air, the crowd silent. She continued, "Tonight, we have speakers who will share their thoughts, experiences, and vision for change. But I want to start by giving the floor to someone who has become the face of this movement, Elijah Brooks." The tension in the room grew, but the message was clear: this wasn't just about talking, it was about action. People weren't here to listen to speeches, they were here to demand change. Elijah's small figure was framed by the lights above as she walked with quiet confidence, shoulders squared, back straight. Sharon saw the nerves behind her eyes, the uncertainty still clinging to her, but also a spark of something else as the crowd erupted in applause. Elijah was a force, not just a victim, a child thrust into something larger than herself. As she opened her mouth, her voice was steady, clear, and strong. "Thank you for listening," she said, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone. She took a deep breath, looking around the room, the silence deafening. "I never thought something like this would happen to me. I'm just a kid, and I was walking home from school, like I do every day. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know why I was being treated this way." Elijah paused, looking down at her hands, gathering her thoughts. "I was scared. I didn't know what was going to happen to me, but I knew it wasn't right. I don't want this to happen to anyone else." Her voice grew stronger. "I want everyone to know that no one should ever be treated like that. Not because of their age, not because of where they live, and definitely not because of the color of their skin. We all deserve respect. We all deserve to feel safe." Her words lingered, and Sharon felt the collective breath of the room held. Elijah wasn't just speaking for herself, she was speaking for every child who had ever been afraid, every person mistreated. Elijah's statements were straightforward but impactful, not just from personal experience but for everyone scared to speak up, silenced by a system that didn't defend them. A long silence preceded the room breaking into applause, hesitant at first, then a standing ovation, everyone cheering. Sharon felt the emotion in the air, an outpouring of support and solidarity. It was a wave of change crashing over this room, this city. As the applause subsided, the mayor stepped forward, her face full of admiration. "You've shown us what true courage looks like. You've inspired us to be better, to do better, and we won't forget what you've taught us." Sharon watched Elijah step down from the stage, her face flushed with the weight of what she'd done. She had spoken to an entire community, and they had heard her, not just listened, but responded. The evening continued with others speaking, offering thoughts on police accountability and needed changes. But as the night wore on, Sharon reflected on what had happened. This wasn't just a town hall or a meeting to discuss one incident, it was the beginning of something bigger. Elijah's voice had sparked a movement demanding change, one that couldn't be ignored. The fight for justice, equality, and accountability had started here, with one child's courage, and it wouldn't end there. Elijah's story had sparked something powerful in this community, something that would echo long after the applause faded. The question wasn't if things would change, it was when. The days following the town hall were a whirlwind. Charleston, traditionally slow and deliberate, felt caught in a hurricane. Protests, demands for justice, and pressure on the police department came too quickly for some, but for others, they were long overdue. It wasn't just the headlines grabbing attention. It was Charleston's residents demanding genuine change. Elijah Brooks had become the face of a movement, the spark that started a fire no one could extinguish. Sharon Mallory stood on the precinct steps, watching news crews set up cameras, the pavement covered in shadows from bright lights. Crowds reassembled, demanding accountability, not just answers. Sharon had seen protests before, waves of outrage following police misconduct, but this was about a culture that had allowed it to continue unchecked for too long. It was time for that to end. Inside the precinct, she felt the weight of eyes following her. Officers were tense, avoiding eye contact, shifting uncomfortably. Kessler was nowhere to be found, no one had seen him for hours, and for good reason. He had become the face of everything wrong with the system. The department had no choice but to act, but Sharon knew it wouldn't be simple. The wheels of justice didn't always turn quickly, and those meant to uphold it often protected themselves. Her heels clicked against the tile as she walked to the Internal Affairs Division's office. The room was dimly lit, fluorescent lights humming eerily. A man in his 40s looked up from a stack of papers. "Detective Mallory," he greeted, no warmth in his tone. "We need to talk about Kessler," she said, not wasting time. "We must review his arrest history, all interactions, everything." The officer, never eager to deal with misconduct, sighed. "The reports have reached us. You don't have to tell me what needs doing, Sharon. But you know things are never as easy as they seem. There's procedures, paperwork." "I don't care about paperwork," Sharon snapped. "I care about Elijah and everyone treated like her. I care about justice. If you think we can waste time on process, you don't understand what this is about." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Sharon leaned against the door frame, arms crossed, staring him down. The officer put down his pen, nodded, acknowledging her words' weight. "I'll pull the files, but it won't be simple. Kessler has high-ranking friends, been here too long to let this go uncontested." "I'm not asking for an easy battle," Sharon replied, her voice steady. "I'm asking for the truth." Hours later, Kessler's files landed on Sharon's desk. His history was lengthy and concerning, complaints over years, but nothing stuck. A pattern of violent conduct, disregard for protocol, and a propensity to target certain communities. Sharon was horrified. This wasn't just one officer, it was a system that had failed. Some complaints, more damning than others, went back over 5 years, yet no action was taken. How many had tried to report Kessler's behavior? How many complaints vanished into a system protecting its own? Sharon picked up the phone and dialed Judge Whitaker. It rang twice before he answered. "What's the latest?" "I have everything," Sharon said. "Kessler's been at this for years. There's a history, but we must do this right and fast." "I keep hearing the same thing," Whitaker replied firmly. "Ensure this reaches the right people. We need pressure from all sides. You have the department's attention, keep it that way." Sharon nodded, though he couldn't see. "We'll act swiftly, but this won't end until Kessler's held accountable." As the investigation gained traction, the media covered every detail. No longer just local, it was national. Elijah's face represented more than one cop's wrongdoing, it stood for everyone harmed by a system meant to protect. The outrage swept the nation like wildfire. Charleston was the focal point of a movement, not just a setting. A shift in public perceptions of accountability and law enforcement. Protests grew louder, more passionate, their calls for justice echoing through the city. Sharon knew things would intensify, but the fight had begun, and there was no turning back. The wheels of justice ground slowly but steadily, and they wouldn't stop until the truth was exposed. The pressure mounted, but Sharon wasn't afraid. She'd seen the truth, seen how far the system would go to protect its own. Now it was time for Kessler to face the consequences. This wasn't just about one officer, it was about all the silenced, ignored, mistreated. It was time for change, and Sharon wouldn't stop until the job was done. The days following the escalation were the most intense of Sharon Mallory's career. The weight of Elijah's wrongful arrest, the protests, and mounting pressure felt like a relentless storm. Sharon was resolved to see justice done, she couldn't let the system ignore this. Charleston, once calm and secure, buzzed with new energy as people who'd never spoken up began to do so. Elijah Brooks, the young girl pulled from the sidewalk, cuffed like a criminal, was now at the center of a movement bigger than any one officer or incident. It was about the city, the country, ensuring every child, regardless of color or age, was treated with dignity and respect. News vans lined Charleston streets, cameras trained on every corner. The story was national, Elijah's arrest footage sparking not just anger but motivation, demanding accountability. As the investigation into Kessler progressed, days blurred together. Every meeting, call, email reminded Sharon time was running out. She had full access to Kessler's records, his history of complaints, his pattern of aggressive behavior. The more she dug, the clearer the truth became: this wasn't isolated. Kessler had been given the benefit of the doubt repeatedly, but now there was no doubt left. The truth was undeniable. It wasn't just Kessler's actions that needed addressing, it was the culture allowing it. The community came together, not just for Elijah but for everyone wronged, ignored, silenced. It was a collective cry for change, impossible to ignore. The system that turned a blind eye had let officers like Kessler abuse power without consequence. Sharon knew the road ahead was tough, but there was no retreating, only forward, toward justice, accountability, a future where people could trust the system to protect, not harm. The breakthrough came when Kessler was placed on administrative leave. The investigation wasn't just about that afternoon with Elijah, it was about years of complaints, unaddressed misconduct. The department couldn't ignore it anymore. As internal affairs dug deeper, it became clear Kessler wasn't the only officer with a history of racial bias, he was just the most visible, the most recent. His actions had opened the floodgates, with others coming forward, victims too afraid to speak before. Sharon had seen the signs. How officers like Kessler operated, using badges to shield themselves. But this time, the tide was turning. The community refused to let this happen again, demanding change. Elijah and her family became unwilling symbols of resistance. They didn't ask for it, didn't choose it, but their experience, Elijah's treatment, became the catalyst for a larger movement. Elijah didn't see it that way, she was just a little girl who wanted to walk home without fear. But as her story spread, her voice heard by more, she realized the weight of it. Her pain, her fear, could drive change. Despite everything, she was proud to be part of it. Protests that started small became impossible to ignore. People gathered outside the police department, City Hall, demanding accountability for Kessler's actions. But it wasn't just protests making an impact, it was the conversations, the way people questioned what they'd accepted for so long. The community had found its collective voice. Then came the moment Sharon had waited for: Kessler's past caught up with him. The internal investigation uncovered the truth, and the department couldn't protect him. Kessler was terminated, his case handed to the district attorney. For Sharon, it was a bittersweet victory. One officer's firing wouldn't fix everything, but it was a start. For the first time in a while, she saw a glimmer of hope. As for Elijah, her life slowly returned to some normalcy, but it wasn't the same. How could it be? She'd seen things no child should, felt things no child should. But she was stronger, empowered. Her voice had been heard, and it made a difference. Charleston was no longer just a city, it was a movement where people united, refused to stay silent. Justice wasn't for a select few, it had to be for everyone. The road ahead was long, the fight for justice far from over. But Sharon was certain change had started. Elijah was no longer just a child, no longer a victim. She was the spark of something that would burn bright for years. This was only the beginning, but it was unavoidable. One voice can spark a tsunami of change in the face of hardship. Charleston had awakened and was determined not to sleep again. It's easy to feel powerless against past injustices, as if systems are too big to challenge. But Elijah's story teaches us that change begins when we refuse to stay silent, when we stand for what's right, demand respect for everyone, regardless of who they are. For those who've experienced years of struggle, progress isn't easy, but it's worth it. No matter how young or small, our words and actions have power. Like Elijah, we all can speak up and create a better future. If you believe standing up for what's right is powerful, please like, subscribe, and share this video to keep inspiring change and improving everyone's quality of life.